Hi everybody. Welcome to my studio where it is really, really cold, so I'm going to try not to freeze my fingers. This video is kind of silly. I'm just going to say that right out front. It's not really a technical heavy demo in terms of how to do something precise with a particular tool. This is really about, I don't really have a lot of tools, but I have hot glue and some tape, an old sock, maybe a staple gun, some Elmer's glue, just kind of playing with things that you have around the house. So I'm specifically aiming a lot of this information towards a project which is called Structure and Skin that I teach to my students. And in that particular instance, or in this instance, we don't have access to our wood shop, and we're all working from home. So I've given them all pre-cut pieces of wood, and so they have to use these as part of the process. And so one of the things that I just sort of really want to encourage in this whole demo and with this particular project is play and experimentation and thinking outside the box. And even when we're at the studio and we have access to all of the woodworking equipment, there are many students who choose not to use those materials for whatever reason. And some are actually really interested in the idea of making work that's more temporal or ephemeral or not permanent, or maybe are just really interested in the combination of a sort of wood construction-y material with some kind of more soft craft-like material. So there's lots of ways that we can play and experiment. One of the things that I would always encourage before you get started on anything that's kind of unfamiliar is that you start with making little models or maquettes or even little drawings, some way that you can get your idea out through playing with a material that doesn't quite feel as precious as the objects in which you are building. And that allows you to kind of learn a lot about the different ways that you can shape and manipulate the material. So in this instance, I took some balsa wood that I had as scraps and I cut them into even tinier pieces. And since I have 10 pieces of wood I'm working with, I made 10 little pieces of balsa wood. And I was kind of thinking that initially it might be interesting to reassemble these pieces of wood, thinking that they used to be a 2x2 and we cut them, and I thought it would be just kind of silly to repair it and glue it back together. I didn't quite know where the skin part of this would come in, so there is an element in this particular assignment that's like about a fabric component or something holding something in tension or mending. So I was like, maybe that comes here, but I wasn't quite sure. So I just started taping the balsa wood together. Another thing that works really good for gluing balsa wood together is hot glue. You can use that pretty quickly as well. And I just kind of started taping it together, and I noticed that because I had used tape, it was sort of flexible. And then I thought it was actually interesting to think about making a more organic line out of the wood. So how I could take these rectilinear forms and then make them feel a little bit more organic. I was trying also to think about something that breaks multiple planes. So I'm not just making a vertical sculpture or something that occupies one axis. I'm inverting it so that I have something that's moving sideways and something that's moving forward, or maybe moving at a diagonal. Maybe there's something else that's going up. So I was trying also to think about this more in the round as opposed to just something kind of in the relief mode or two-dimensional. So I actually thought that I had a pretty solid idea after having played with this balsa wood in multiple configurations. And so I did start to translate it into my larger pieces of wood. And as I was working with the larger pieces of wood, I became interested in something else. And it feels silly. It's not done yet. I don't quite know where this is going just yet, and I'm okay with that, and I encourage that in all of you, which is just sort of make a decision, make a model, and then respond to the work as you are making it. So these are the pieces that I started making, and they were intended to be connected together, and I just kind of liked them as these little kind of conversations on their own. This one actually leans against the wall really nice. So if there's a wall here, it just leans and balances against the wall. So I kind of think about them like half-finished thoughts. And they are connected or sort of like glued or assembled together in a really funny way. Each of these little knuckles or joints right here has just tape, masking tape, and newspaper crumbled up and then shaped and taped together. And so underneath each one of these is just the same kind of silly looking tape blob. And then because I had plaster bandages from another project, I thought, oh, that would actually be really interesting because a plaster bandage would make this kind of nice and stable. And visually, I like the aesthetic of the sort of white color of the plaster next to the raw construction grade lumber. So I went ahead and did that. And again, I had intended for all of these to be assembled together. I don't know where this one went. But as I was making these pieces, like this one I just thought was lovely on its own. And so I'm gonna eventually just tear this off and figure out what else I'm gonna do. So again, I'm being kind of silly. I'm just experimenting. I don't really have an intended outcome, except for I'm wanting to work with processes and working with materials and problem solving and figuring some things out. I should also say at some point there needs to be a skin component on here. And I did think, I've got stuff laying all over the place here, that, you know, perhaps the shape here could just be a string kind of holding this in tension. So it kind of giving the appearance that it's in a little tension. Maybe the string is just hanging. Maybe it's connecting all of these different elements. And I don't know how they sort of plug into one another yet, but you know, there's something I can play with in that respect. If I want to be really silly, I could think about grabbing one of my daughter's socks and maybe dressing the form with something like that. I don't know. I don't know. And that's okay, right? It's okay not to know. It's okay to just sort of play and to kind of figure out if something is interesting or if it isn't interesting. In the studio, I like to just like make without sort of judging my own actions. And I would encourage you to sort of do the same thing. And then, you know, if it's sort of temporary like this, you could photograph it and then try something else and then revisit that and maybe revisit it the next day, but not right away, or do several things and then sort of sit with those images while you take a little break from your studio. So there, if we're thinking about sort of just the basics, in the kit that my students got for this particular assignment, they got the wood, the little balsa pieces, and a sheet of sandpaper. And, you know, if you have access to a palm sander or a Dremel tool or anything like that, you can do more sanding and carving. But we are thinking just about the inherent properties of this material. And this is just sort of like the cheapest 2x2 that you can buy at the hardware store. And so, you know, trying to sand and polish this really smooth would be kind of silly. Maybe that's important to you. But at the very least, if you don't want sort of sharp edges, you can use the sandpaper to just kind of clean it up. And it will actually bevel it pretty fast if you apply a lot of pressure. Or you can round the edge. So if you just want a little bit more of detail, you can do that on all of the corners or maybe on the face. So it's something to think about, that sandpaper could be handy for cleaning up edges. And I would do that to the pieces before you decide how you're going to assemble them, so that it's easier to do when they're in pieces versus as a whole unit, unless you are planning on assembling it, gluing it together, and then coming after it with like a palm sander afterwards to really smooth the transition between all of these, like if you were to laminate these pieces together, for example. So I have 10 pieces, and I'm going to go through lots of different weird things that you can do, and they're all just ideas, and you can take them or leave them. So first thing that I might want to decide with my big pieces is, you can also play with these. You don't have to play with just the small pieces of balsa wood, but if I were to build some kind of a structure, what would that be? What's my skill level? Do I really want something that's balanced and stable? Do I want something that feels a little bit more like wonky and kind of precarious? How can I make this form a little bit more dynamic? Could I play with negative space? So could I make this sort of like heavy frame if I glued everything together? Or like that. What happens if these shifted direction and they weren't all lined up, or if some came forward and some came back? Would that be kind of more interesting or not? Is that negative space worth my while? Do I want something that feels small and condensed, or do I want something that feels a little bit more open, a little bit more light and airy? Something that kind of feels like a puzzle. I don't know if these dimensions will actually come together in any kind of manner, but this is kind of fun to sort of build something like this. Maybe just these two corners touch. I do want, in this instance, all the pieces of wood to be used. So maybe I could build this even one higher. Woo! And, I think that's what's really interesting about working with a set material, is that you kind of have some constraints, but you can be really expansive with what you do, or more kind of constrictive. So there's lots of ways that you can play with this. And if I were to assemble this together in a permanent way, at the very least, I could stick it together with a hot glue gun, and that would hold it pretty well. I certainly wouldn't want to build furniture and glue it together with hot glue, but for our purposes, for these kinds of small scale little sculptures, hot glue would work. The one thing that I don't love about hot glue and wood is that it's got a little bit of a thickness to it, and you'll see a little gap or a little space between the wood. And so either you try to be as careful to avoid that as possible, or make it less visible, or maybe work with it and like really put a big thick glob of hot glue so that we really see it stuck together with hot glue. But you could also use other glues if you have anything available. So ideally you glue wood together with a wood glue. And wood glue is actually a super strong bond. It's probably stronger than the nail or the screw that holds the wood together. I like to think about the wood and the screw actually acting as a clamp, holding the glue in place while it dries. So you could actually make really stable things with the wood glue. But if you don't have wood glue and you happen to have some Elmer's glue all, that probably would also suffice and do a good job. And I wouldn't recommend Elmer's school glue because that's a little bit more brittle. But if you have glue all, this is going to work fine. And a couple of these pieces are actually glued together with the Elmer's glue all. I would just sort of wanted to think about gluing something together with a non-traditional material. And all I did when I glued this together, and I think I have one here, I should have done this with blue tape, but I just glued it together and then, whoops, stuck it together with masking tape to hold it in place while it clamped to dry. And that was hours ago, and so I can take that off. But glue and tape make really nice clamps together. So that can be a super simple way of making two things connected. I also happen to have like some PVA book binding glue. This would work really good to hold that together, but that's a little bit more specialized. I imagine if you have PVA glue, you're probably going to have Elmer's glue, but maybe not. Let's see. Again, as I'm working, I'm thinking about what the structure is and what the skin is for this particular assignment. And yeah, just sort of thinking beyond sort of the traditional ideas, but nylons stretch really beautifully, but old t-shirts, netting. I also was just kind of wandering around my house and my studio thinking like, if I don't want to go out into the world and go buy something new, what do I have? Well, I have bubble wrap. So I kind of like that as a visual texture, and I like that when it's taut. It's kind of like really, if it can appear sort of rigid. You got plastic drop cloths in your kit, and so maybe even just that sort of like weird frosty-like color would be an interesting skin. I had some old t-shirts that I was using to make that t-shirt elastic, and so I still have this little scrap here that I could use for something. I even went into the kitchen and stole the onions because I thought that this was interesting. It's kind of like fishnet. I don't have fishnets, but I have an onion sack, and so maybe that could work as a skin to sort of stretch over the form. What else do I have here? I just have some weird things. I'm just sort of going through the like, what do I have? And then I'm going to like take a couple things and actually assemble and glue and show you the how-tos of some of those things. The other thing, since I'm in my garage, I found these weird little foam insulators to go around corners. And I even kind of thought that those might be interesting as little transitions to play with. Ugh. So I don't know. I'd probably have to test hot glue with this. This foam could melt with the hot glue, so I maybe want to do a little test, but maybe this is again where the string comes into play. It's like crocheted string. And I kind of tie that into place. Now again, if we're thinking about the inherent property of the materials, meaning I don't want these pieces to be painted when finished, unless it is like absolutely really important to the idea. So what is it about the materials that you find that actually contain the color? Maybe even the sandpaper becomes a surface that you cut and glue on as a surface, and that becomes the visual color and texture that we sort of pick up and perceive, as opposed to painting it that sandy color or painting the corner black. What happens if you find something that is that black and combine it? Like, I kind of think these three colors together are really beautiful. This black and this sort of, I don't know what color that is. and this piece of wood. Like, there's something nice about the color combination there. Even something as silly as like a plastic wrapper could be an interesting thing to play with. I was digging in my recycling and my trash. And you could think about these as becoming one form. So you saw me when I was kind of holding that Tetrisy-like shape together. But maybe these are each individual pieces and they never get glued together, or they get wrapped in different shapes and textures individually that then get stacked together or assembled. So maybe I just glue the sandpaper on the face of one or two of these and maybe on the end. Maybe I fully wrap this one in sandpaper. Maybe I cut this wrapper open and carefully wrap another piece of wood in that. I don't know, maybe one is covered in a sock. One is in plastic. Maybe 10 are in plastic and, well, I actually only have 10, but 8 are in plastic and 2 are in something else or raw wood. So again, the possibilities are endless. That's where I'm getting at. Okay. Another cool thing that you can do with the wood, and I've had students do this before, somebody made this like really complex sort of spiraling sculpture out of these smaller pieces that they had then cut on the bandsaw, and they just used a stapler to assemble this pretty giant sculpture. And so you can do that as well. Now, I had just my regular stapler, and that might be all that you have. In that case, you'd want to sort of play and experiment, because the stapler didn't seem to want to go in one piece kind of on its own, unless it was going against the grain, not with the grain. So when I tried to go with the grain, well, it just fell out. Usually it kind of wants to slide off to the side. I actually had one successful one just because I said it wasn't going to work with the grain. And all my practice, that hadn't happened until this one time. So you would want to avoid that, because I got like 10 bad staples before I got one that worked. But for some reason it works against the grain of the wood. And so if this was all that you had, was a little home stapler, and you wanted to use that because you liked the visual effect, one, you could just apply it only to the wood as like a surface. That could kind of be the skin. Or you could use it to attach two pieces of wood together. So I'm just kind of suspending this between the two pieces of wood. These are kind of like stitches or sutures. It's so interesting when I do this like structure and skin assignment. I usually never think of the skin as sort of this literal material, but now here I am stapling it together and calling it a suture. And as I was making these pieces, I was thinking about them like knuckles or cartilage or something like that. So I don't know. Maybe I've been home too long. So I'm having mostly success and some failure. And I could pack these a much closer together, but there is a piece of wood assembled with just staples. Again, I don't recall that it works on the end pieces, but you just want to play and experiment to see if you could get those to stay together. I don't think it did. Well, guess what? I'm out of staples, so I can't try. But also, I happen to have a sort of more industrial staple gun, and so that also could be really fantastic. This might be loud. Uh-oh. There we go. So that one sort of certainly feels visually it's got more presence, and structurally it's probably going to hold it a lot better. I also put them closer together. That would take a lot of staples to really put that together, but I think that could be a really beautiful material shift. So I don't know. Maybe there's something fun there. Okay, so as I'm continuing to assemble some things, you know, in the past I've had students actually put hinges on these pieces so that they move and can take on different forms, so they can be a little flexible. But I was thinking you could also do the same thing with masking tape, or if you happen to have some duct tape, that can work as well. This does not feel like tough duct tape. We'll see how this works. So this is not the width that I want it to be or need it to be. And I actually, even though it seems like I'm just sort of playing and being silly, and I am for the demo, when I would go to do my final piece, I would think about that. I would think like, I actually want the duct tape to be the correct width that I am working with. And so I'm actually going to use my ruler here. You can't see what I'm doing, but let me show you. I've put my duct tape down on a cutting mat, so some kind of a surface that it can release from. I'll measure the width of my piece of wood, and then very carefully using my retractable blade, I can cut this to the width that I want it, and then I'll have just the perfect width of duct tape. And then maybe I also don't want the torn edges. Maybe I do, but maybe I don't. So I could either cut those with the scissors or with the utility knife, and you know, think about where these are placed on the wood. Are they covering the whole length or just a ½ inch on the end? Is it the same on both pieces? Is this actually duct tape? I'm serious, it's so not sticky. I don't know. I don't know. It says it's Ruffy's Pro. Don't buy that one. Maybe it's just old. Okay, so stick that together. Now it's like the perfect width of these two. I can then open it up and let's say put this piece on the inside here. And as I'm starting to play and experiment, there's like, I think there's something interesting that's kind of happening here, which is that if this is something that's like flexible and bends, that, you know, the duct tape does have a color contrast with the wood, and you can buy colored duct tape and things like that, but okay, it actually might stick better than I thought. Yeah, but now we have like a flexible form. So do you want something that is bendable and movable? Because you can do that. So you could just make hinges, and they could, you know, hinge in different directions, and then you could have a sort of flexible sculpture. Also, as I'm looking at this extra little strip that's right here, I'm starting to think about other things that I can do to sort of put a skin on the surface. And, you know, maybe this would be kind of interesting if I wrapped it around. Could be uniform stripes, or it could be these kind of zigzag shapes. So again, I don't know. I'm just playing. I'm seeing what they do. I told you I would glue some things together, so let me just show you what that would look like. So I could do a sort of like a butt joint this way, or another one right here. This is not going to work super great to, like, you know, you can't really get a little angle together like that. I could put a post in there though, and Maybe glue these two things together to kind of get this tripod shape. But you do want to think about that before you glue some things together. I noticed that this piece of wood has a little lean to it. It wasn't cut totally straight. So do I want to highlight that little lean, or do I want to not? I like it. So I'll just use some of the Elmer's glue. Again, there's nothing like super technical here. Usually, because wood is porous, you do want to, uh-oh, was that the end with the lean? I don't think it was. Maybe you should mark it so you remember. But you do want to put the glue on both sides. If you have a scrap of cardboard or another little piece of wood, you could use your finger as well. But you kind of want to spread the glue out so that it's not just sort of blobby like that. You're wanting it more smoothed out. Okay, you want enough on the surface so that like a little bit squeezes out the sides when you compress it together, but not just like oozing. But if you do have a lot of glue and it's coming out of the sides, clean it up with a damp rag before it dries. Otherwise, it's really hard. It's not impossible, but it's really hard to like sand or scrape down dried glue, especially wood glue. So I usually, if I'm building something and I don't want to deal with the glue, especially if I'm staining or varnishing it, I will have a damp cloth that I wipe all that glue away with. So this is pretty simple. It would just be these two pieces going together like this. Now if I had, I do, but I'm not going to use it. If I could use a bar clamp to sort of hold this together, but I'm just going to pretend I don't have those things and all I have is some masking tape. And so you can sort of just simply get away with putting a piece around the center and then letting that sit for 30 minutes before you like start handling it. But probably usually it's about 24 hours before your wood glue totally cures or whatever it is you used. So you could go all the way around, or if I go like this from the top down, then this is almost like a closer to a clamp. I'm thinking of like the ratchet strap and how that kind of works. Okay, so that's probably fine. Again, I'm not trying to make something that I'm going to sit on. But as I said, like I would definitely keep it taped for at least 30 minutes, but if you can leave it for a couple hours, then that's even better. But then you want to wait for that full cure strength after about 24 hours. Okay. Oh, I had another thing. I knew there was something else before I sort of switched to something else. I was going to try to make a hinge out of fabric, or just show you a way that if you had a frame assembled and you wanted to attach your skin to it, you do want to think about what that end looks like and how it connects to the wood form. So if you like the rawness of the sort of like torn edge, then that's great. If you don't, then just fold it under. And I just want it to be something that you have an awareness. So sort of think about the overall aesthetic and make sure that it's working for you as you go and it doesn't feel sort of lazy and not considered. So even though I'm talking about play, I'm still talking about also then fine tuning it. So if it's gonna be rough, that's okay, but I just want you to not be lazy about it. But you can tuck it in and fold it and then have that sort of pulling on the form. And I've had students do really cool things where they have things hiding underneath, whether that be the wood or something else that catches some of that tension in that. Okay, my camera just turned off and that's telling me to wrap it up, basically. So, final thought, and again, this is not the definitive way of assembling. This is like, you know, just the tip of the iceberg of if I thought you might pay attention for 2 or 3 hours, I would just keep going. Okay, so I have the t-shirt. I thought I'll just use actually the end of the sleeve that's already tucked. And I have these like flathead, oopsies, thumbtacks. And this would work really good to connect the fabric to the wood. Like if you think about upholstery tacks, you could also get something like that. The good news is this wood here isn't super hard, and so the thumbtack is definitely going to go inside of there, and then you could decide whether this becomes just a functional element, like holding it in place, or whether it starts to become a visual element and you start putting them in places just as accents or as decorations or sort of whatever that becomes. So there we go. Okay. So I'm primarily focused on structure, hinted a little bit at the skin, fully enclosed or an exposed skeletal system. I am actually going to clean these edges up a little bit. I want the connection between the wood and the plaster to be a little bit more clean, so I have a little scrapey tool. Maybe I could do a little sanding afterwards. After this, I'm going to wait for this to cure 24 hours so it's nice and fully set. And if I make any good progress on this, I'll show you what it becomes, but I don't know. I'm just playing and practicing, and that is what I want you to do, is practice your way towards a new technique that you've made up or sort of done a variation of something I've done here, and just sort of seeing what you come up with, and then seeing that process through to the end, sort of just following it where it takes you and coming up with a form, whatever that may be. So thanks everybody. Have fun.